The threat of a potential rail strike has many Canadians worried, especially us here in Western Canada, since so much of our grain is transported by train. It would also negatively impact our oil and gas sector. Now, to chat about this in more detail is Sun political columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, is the Trudeau government doing anything to help avoid a strike or lockout?
Well, I mean, they're talking to all the parties involved, and this is an odd year, Hal. You've got both CPKC and CN Rail facing potential strikes, lockouts, essentially, at the same time. They normally have their contracts staggered, and you'll forgive me, I forget which one extended their contract by a year during the pandemic, and so now they're up for renewal at the same time. Normally, they're staggered, and if one goes on strike, well, then you can shove as much goods onto the other train system as you can. Now it's both at the same time, and this is showing how important the rail industry is to Canada. $1 billion a day worth of goods moves across the country, and you're right, a lot of grain, a lot of oil. I saw those trains when I was out in Sask recently, driving down Highway 11 out of Saskatoon. Lots of huge trains. I know you experienced them throughout Alberta as well, but it's straight across the country. I mean, you've got the Canadian Federation of Independent Business saying how worried they are. Because if you're a small business that, let's say you're retail and you're importing things, whether it's from Asia or Europe, a lot of that's going to come in by ship and then move across this country by rail. If you are a meat producer, you're going to ship it from your plant to the port to export it by rail. Everybody's going to be impacted by this. So what's the Trudeau government doing? Well, Labor Minister Steve McKinnon is trying to talk to the parties involved, try to say, hey, look, come to an agreement, offering arbitration. One thing that he can't do now, or he could try, but he would be unsuccessful, is back to work legislation. I've heard people say they've got to bring in back to work legislation. First off, it's going to be a lockout, not a strike. So that is the employer locking out the workers before they have a chance to get on strike. That's something that happens in certain industries. But secondly, due to a 2015 court decision that we've discussed before, when Justice Rosalie Abella said the time has come to recognize the right for the right to strike be recognized in the charter, back to work legislation has effectively been illegal. It's been tried a few times, but challenged in court. So hopefully, if there is a strike, it's very short in duration, but let's hope that all sides, and it's not just both sides here, let's hope all sides are able to come to an agreement. Otherwise, an awful lot of commerce will come to a grinding, screeching halt as the train tries to stop in time.
Brian, the Liberal government is promising to fix the temporary foreign workers program, which many say has simply gotten out of control. Now, you say it is problematic due to changes the federal government made, 2 years ago?
Yeah, April 2022, just less than 2 weeks after they signed their coalition agreement with the NDP, the party of the worker. Well, the Trudeau Liberals brought in these changes that raised caps. There used to be a cap of you couldn't have more than 10% of your employees come through the temporary foreign worker program. It's to protect jobs for Canadians and not just have you say, well, we'll send across to whatever country, pay them cheaper wages, and have them come into Canada. By the way, this is all separate from the agricultural foreign workers program, which is a very different one. This is low wage positions. These are working in hotels and restaurants, in some cases outside of the low wage areas, such as construction. But they got rid of those 10% caps, moved it to 20% for most industries. But then in construction, healthcare, nursing homes, food and accommodation services, they said you could have 30% of your workforce come from the temporary foreign worker program. They made other changes as well, such as if unemployment goes above 6%, there used to be restrictions that would come in. They got rid of those. They changed the program so much, they effectively put it on steroids. And now you've got a rising unemployment rate. You've got a lot of complaints of people saying this simply isn't fair. Mike Moffat, Liberal, worked with the Liberal Party at one point, worked with the Trudeau government, an academic, an economist. He said this is a wage suppression move. And he's been very critical of the government, despite being aligned with the Trudeau government many times in the past. He's calling this wage suppression and says it has to stop. I don't think he's wrong.
Now, there's been a lot of online concern by many who say that Tim Hortons is being overly reliant on the temporary foreign workers program, Brian. You say, however, it's not just Timmy's, but a Liberal MP has even used the program?
Yeah, look, I understand people looking for a villain in this, and so they're picking on Tim Hortons. And Tim Hortons, by the way, most of them are franchised, and so people are applying for what's called a labor market impact assessment. That's the document the federal government says you're right. You can't find a Canadian to do the job. You can bring in people from out of the country. Looks like some Tim Hortons, but also others in the food and retail industry are becoming overly reliant on this. But an astute reader of mine pointed out you got to check out Liberal MP Sukh Dhaliwal. He's an MP from Surrey, British Columbia. Before going into politics, he started and still owns a land surveying company. It's called Dhaliwal and Associates Land Surveying. They promote on their website that they're run by Sukh Dhaliwal, Liberal MP, and he was approved for legal assistant, legal administrative assistant. Sorry, is the full term, and recently hired someone on this. So this is a very widespread program, and at a time when we have rising unemployment, a housing crisis, a healthcare crisis because we don't have full access to the medical facilities that we need or care that we need. How much sense does it bring in? How much sense does it make to bring in so many people at once into the country? But you could say that writ large about the entire Trudeau immigration program. The Prime Minister has even said that it reduces and suppresses wages, and he says that it's a problem. We're bringing in people faster than we can absorb. If only he knew someone who could do something about this, Hal. But the Liberals are walking around talking about this program being problematic and not acknowledging that they're the ones that caused the problem or that they're the ones that could fix it.
Do you think maybe the Liberals are thinking more of an open door policy when it comes to the temporary foreign workers, that maybe some of those foreign workers from other countries could be votes for the Liberal Party?
Well, it would still, under the current system, it would still be several years before they could be voters. And I've heard, that's been the response of a lot of critics online. They reply to me and they say, well, they're just importing their next voting base for the next election. It still takes 3 years at this point, minimum, most 5, to become a citizen. And that's still what you need to vote. So under the current system, they couldn't. Now, are they open to an open border policy? It would seem that, because look at Mark Miller's responses when asked about the large increase in the number of temporary residents. He said, well, if it's problematic, why don't we just make them permanent? Okay, well, then you've allowed them to jump the queue because you've still got a ton of people trying to come in from the regular system who are waiting in line, following the rules. If you don't think that what the Liberals are doing now is aggravating the immigrant community in Canada, then you don't know the immigrant community. And I actually don't think the Liberal government does, as much as they will talk about it. This will irritate people. The people that lined up, followed the rules, did what they were supposed to do to come to Canada, to be Canadian, they're going to look at this and say, well, why are you just opening the doors? Why did I bother following the rules and take years and jump through hoops? I could have just done this.
Brian, speaking of folks who are irritated, there's a lot of anger this week when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that former radio and TV host Charles Adler was appointed to the Senate. Now, it's led to calls for the Senate to be reformed or even abolished, but you say that ain't happening.
Theoretically, it can be done. Realistically, good luck. So we all know that if you want to abolish the Senate, what do you have to do? You have to get a constitutional amendment. If you want to reform the Senate in any meaningful way, make it what Alberta's long called for: elected, effective, and equal, or I guess it was equal, elected, and effective. If you want to do that, you need a constitutional reform. Stephen Harper tried many ways to use legislation, to use convention to try and change things. And in 2014, the Supreme Court said, no, any of these things you want to do, like electing senators and making that stick, that has to have a constitutional amendment. And by the way, there have been 5 elected senators from Alberta appointed, 1 by Brian Mulroney, 4 by Stephen Harper. You'll notice that when the Liberals are in power, they don't appoint elected senators. So you need to put it into law or a change to make that happen. And the Supreme Court says you need to do that with a constitutional amendment. So abolish or reform, you need to amend the Constitution. That requires 7 provinces covering 50% of the population. Even if you could get that, What happens as soon as you open up the Constitution? Quebec sticks up their hand and says, oh, we want to insert a bunch more things for us. Alberta would say, we want the Alberta Sovereignty Act recognized. Saskatchewan would say, me too. And then every Indigenous group across the country would be saying, you know what? We've got some ideas of what we want in there. You can't just open it up for this one thing. I do not see that happening. Every time it's talked about for whatever reason to change the Constitution for one item, everybody else says, oh no, not one item. We've got a whole laundry list of things to change. And at that point, it becomes unworkable.
Now, Brian, a group of Manitoba Indigenous leaders is calling for the Prime Minister to rescind Charles Adler's appointment based on comments he made, around 15 years ago? What did he say?
He was talking about an issue surrounding certain chiefs, and he referred to the chiefs as boneheads. And people are saying, well, that's racist and you can't do that. Well, if he's talking about the actions of the chiefs, if you can't call a chief a bonehead, why can you call the prime minister a bonehead or a premier a bonehead? You don't get an automatic pass being a political leader just because of your race. And so I know this will upset some people because I know I've heard from people they don't want Charles Adler in the Senate and he's a sellout now and he's a Trudeau hack. That's all fair. But I'm sure if you looked at the full context of the comments, which were complained about, went to an arbitrator and they said, no, this is all fair comment, that's not going to get Adler tossed. I'm not sure anything will. I think Trudeau's going to stick by him. We've seen how bad you have to be for Justin Trudeau to rescind your appointment. We've seen that just recently with the guy who he wanted to head up the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I don't see this being enough, but as soon as I saw it, and full disclosure, I used to work with Charles Adler. We were at Sun News Network together, as were you. He was a columnist for the Sun newspapers across the country. He was on his radio program many times. But he has changed his politics completely, and he absolutely became a Trudeau cheerleader. But I'm betting most of the people who don't want him in the Senate now would probably agree with the comments they're complaining about from 15 years ago.
Brian, the Trudeau government has been thinking of revoking the citizenship of a man who was arrested in a terror plot and is alleged to have been featured in an ISIS torture video. Now, didn't Trudeau once say a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian?
Not only did he say that, but he said terrorists should keep their Canadian citizenship. He was that blunt. He said that in Winnipeg ahead of the 2015 election. And then, he said many times a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And so when Mark Miller, the immigration minister, started talking about revoking this gentleman's citizenship, his name is Ahmed El-Didi, people said, oh, so I guess a Canadian isn't a Canadian is a Canadian. And I said, no, wait a minute. I know the answer to this because there's a famous clip, and I was sharing it last week, lots of people were, of the Monk foreign policy debate in the 2015 election. Stephen Harper had passed a law that said if you are a dual citizen and you take up arms against Canada, you can be stripped of your Canadian citizenship if you're convicted of doing so. That's when Trudeau said a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. So I'm at the debate, and I asked him afterwards, I said, going back to your father's time, Canada has tried to deport Nazi war criminals. We're trying to do it right now. What's the difference? And he said, they lied on their application. So it's not what they did. It's that the paperwork was incorrect, Hal. They didn't follow the right process. They didn't. They lied on the application. To Justin Trudeau, that's worse than the act of taking up arms against Canada or being involved in an ISIS torture video or allegedly being involved in a terror plot. All those things are fine. Lying on your application, that's a bridge too far. And if you do that, Justin Trudeau wants you kicked out of the country.
There's a little bit of an embarrassing moment for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. His team released a video about the Canadian dream, but they had to delete it. And it turns out some of the visuals were anything but Canadian.
Yeah, and this is unfortunate because some of the visuals were fighter jets, which apparently were Russian fighter jets. And of course, the Liberals always trying to link Pierre Poilievre in any way to Donald Trump. And of course, in the States, they say Donald Trump is, the Democrats say Donald Trump is a tool of Russia, doesn't support Ukraine, he's friends with Vladimir Putin. So they're trying to do that now. A bit of an own goal for Poilievre's department. they've been very slick with their video production for a long time. They've been very good at using visual mediums and sharing it, whether it's an ad on TV, which they've run, including the Tent City ad recently, or whether it's social media videos. They're very good at using the medium. Somebody wasn't paying attention here. They got caught. The Liberals saw it, pounced on it right away. It's not going to be a huge thing, but it's a distraction, and it allows the Liberal haters of Polyev, of which there are many, to point at him, giggle, make accusations that he's in bed with Putin as well.
Now, will that recent slip-up change voters' minds, or do the Tories still have a commanding lead at the polls?
Oh, still a commanding lead. The latest Abacus poll is a 20-point lead, 43% to 23% for the Liberals. Leger has it 41% to 23. Nanos, it's a bit smaller. It's a 14 to 16-point gap. He does a weekly tracking poll, and it's been in that range. So, if Liberals wanted to say, oh, look, we're just at a 14.5% gap now, we're closing in on them, that's still a massive majority. If Pierre Poilievre beat the Liberals by 14.5%, that's a massive majority. Some of the polling, both Leger shows the Conservatives gaining in Quebec, but not in the lead. Abacus shows the Conservatives in the lead in Quebec. It's harder once you get down to regional numbers, but everywhere in the country, the Conservatives are doing much better. The Liberals are doing much worse. And the underlying factors, they don't help the Liberals come back. Canadians no longer trust the Liberals on the issues that matter right now. We're a long way away from an election. Remember what I always say, Hal? Voters are fickle, polls can change, campaigns matter. But if the vote were held right now, it'd be a massive Conservative majority.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today from Toronto.
Thank you, Hal.